सहस्रशीर्षा पुरुषः सहस्राक्षः सहस्रपात् स भूमिं विश्वतो कृत्वा अत्यतिष्ठत्.
Thank you for listening to Light of the Vedas. This is your host, Sri Sachinandan Das. So in the previous episode, we began discussing the Bhagavad Gita, and we talked about the lamentation of Arjuna, as well as the basic instruction, the first instruction of the Bhagavad Gita, that one is not the body. And then we also discussed karma yoga, or performing one's duties in a detached state of consciousness due to the development of transcendental knowledge within oneself, which Krishna also calls buddhi yoga. Buddhi means intelligence, which refers to this transcendental knowledge. It's the gradual development of intelligence, of spiritual intelligence, the capacity to see reality clearly for what it is and to move beyond illusion. And while working in that consciousness, doing one's regular duties, dealing with your job and your family and everything like that, you eliminate within you the selfish motivation, and that eliminates the karma that would come back to you. And so you become free from samsara, or bondage to the cycle of birth and death under the law of karma. And so Krishna really recommends this in the Bhagavad Gita, and this is in many ways the beginning of spiritual life. And in all the various systems of yoga, which Krishna talks about, Jnana Yoga, Ashtanga Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, there is this element in the beginning of performing your duties and becoming detached from the fruits. And Krishna also talks about this, like why perform your particular duties? Why do these things while developing spiritual knowledge? Well, they purify you, especially if you do them according to the scriptures. They gradually elevate your consciousness. And not only that, but they're a form of sensual control. You have to keep the senses under control. You have to keep yourself properly engaged. It's just like if you have a bunch of children. Like I remember when I went to grammar school, it's like I was kind of a bad kid sometimes, so I'd always throw rocks and tan bark and, all these different things around the playground. And so the teacher would make me sit in a red square, like on the ground. There's a red square spray painted, and I'd have to sit there, while all the other kids played. And so that's one way of dealing with a bad kid or a kid who won't engage properly. And yet the other way is if somehow the teacher can find a way to keep the kid busy, to keep him engaged in something which is constructive and good while he learns and while he develops character and while he learns right from wrong and while he understands the nature of society and the need to treat others properly. And so that's kind of what karma yoga is like. You within the scripture gives you the right, it gives you the adhikar, and the opportunity to perform activities according to your nature. And you have the right to do this. And yet when you perform them according to the scriptures, it's like you're being engaged in something which is good for you and uplifting for you and keeps you out of trouble. And it controls your senses, your ears, your eyes, your nose, your tongue. And meditation and absorption in the Supreme, it really begins with sensual control. Unless you're able to control the body and how you use it and refrain especially from sinful activities, then it's not possible to control the mind and to focus the mind, which is really the essence of meditation and the essence of yoga. It's really all about the mind and where you put the mind, what you focus the mind upon, and that's meditation. But you can't meditate and you can't enter into deeper states of consciousness if your senses are uncontrolled, if you're absorbed in the world, trying to enjoy the world. And the senses, they're constantly putting forward desires, The tongue is constantly saying, feed me this, give me this. Generally, we don't distinguish between ourself and these desires because we identify with the body. We think, when the tongue demands, give me ice cream, right? We think, I want ice cream. But it's not really I, that's called ahankar, or the false ego. It's the illusion that you are the body. It's the body. The body is demanding. And specifically the senses, the tongue, is demanding, give me ice cream. And because we've conditioned the senses to enjoy matter. Over many, many lifetimes we've been eating things, been gratifying the needs of the tongue, and whatever it demands, we supply it. We've been we've been feeding the demand for ice cream so long that when the tongue demands ice cream, it's very intense, it's very powerful, it's very forceful, it has a lot of strength, and it's kind of like, in a sense, meditation is the focus of the consciousness on the divine, and for many lifetimes we've focused the consciousness on gratifying the desires of the body. And therefore the body has become very strong by our meditation on material enjoyment. And the force of the body, the intensity of the demands of the body, it's very strong, and we serve the body out of illusion. We try to fulfill its demands. Whereas in the mind, for many lifetimes, because we've been absorbing it in material existence and gratifying the demands of the body, the mind is conditioned to meditate upon material enjoyment. It's conditioned to think and to observe and to absorb itself within matter and material concerns and absorb itself within enjoying the world. It's basically everyone's meditating because the mind is a tool of meditation. The spiritualist meditates upon the absolute truth, and the materialist meditates upon the world and trying to enjoy the world. And so because we've been absorbed in this kind of materialistic meditation for so long, the mind and body become an obstacle to spiritual realization. They're untrained, just like a dog. You have like the dog whisperer or something, he gradually tames the dogs and trains them and reconditions them to accept authority. And so our own mind and body, which should be subservient to the soul, they're actually in control. They're like an untrained dog, which is sort of ruled over the household. It's been in a dominant position for so long that it has to be retrained and it has to be housebroken, right? And so the beginnings of spiritual life, no matter what your process of yoga is, it really begins with controlling the body, controlling the mind, regulating oneself, yama niyama, it's proper and improper behavior. There's a sense in which one has to control one's behavior, which is a very broad application of sensual control. And then one has to control the senses themselves and gradually strengthen one's dominance over the body and one's capacity to resist the demands of the body. And then one goes more subtle and trains the mind and resists the demands of the mind. And then when one has conquered over one's social conditions as well as one's own body and the urges of the body and the urges of the mind, then one can put the mind upon the absolute truth. And when you train the mind to seek out the absolute truth, by gradually training it, it becomes a powerful ally, a powerful friend. Just like if you have a well-trained dog, like one of these pets, like a police dog or an emergency rescue dog, they're powerful allies because they've been trained to behave in a certain way. So similarly, the yogi, he trains his or her mind and body to seek after the absolute truth. And it becomes conditioned to that. And over decades, it'll automatically go towards the absolute truth. Rather than the mind absorbing in material existence and contemplating how to enjoy, the mind will absorb automatically within the Supreme. And get up in the morning and the first thing the mind goes to is the Supreme, because you've been thinking about it so much and you've trained the mind to do that. And so in many ways the yogis are like Olympic athletes. Olympic athletes train very, very hard, very seriously to achieve a perfection in a certain activity. Athletic activity. And so the yogi trains very, very hard to gain control over the mind and senses and then direct the mind and senses towards the Supreme so that they are trained to go towards the Supreme themselves. And this is really the one of the essential core teachings of yoga. And so Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, he discusses the tension between the urges of the mind and the body, which is called kama, or lust, and jnana, or knowledge, transcendental knowledge. Knowledge that you are supreme, you are a soul beyond matter, that you're ultimately a servant of God. That knowledge is in tension with the lust that's within the body, and the lust that's within the mind, and the lust in the intelligence. And so there's this war going on within us where we have to move the lines of the battlefield. Krishna actually gives an example of lust has captured the senses and the body, and then from there it captures the mind, and from there it captures the intelligence. When it captures the intelligence, you totally forget who you are as a soul. That's like the final battleground where you're defeated spiritually. If lust overcomes the intelligence, then you behave in self-destructive ways and you become totally absorbed in illusion and you forget your true spiritual nature as a soul. But on the other side, if you if you become spiritually strong, especially by hearing properly from proper sources, as we've been discussing, hearing the spiritual message from the disciplic succession that is pure and powerful and untinged with illusion, and in serving and applying that particular knowledge, then gradually one's intelligence becomes strong. That battleground of intelligence becomes fixed, and you see the world through the scriptures. And then by seeing the world in that way, then you can control the mind. You can recognize the desires of the mind and check the urges of the mind and sort of restrain and retrain the mind. And then when you're able to do that, then the senses will be retrained. And the senses will be engaged properly. The physical body will be utilized for self-realization, either in, practicing meditation, or it could be in practicing direct worship of God, like, for example, worshiping a deity in a temple, or it could be engaged in doing one's duties, one's material duties, such as, going to one's job and taking care of one's family, these various responsibilities as they are outlined within the Vedic literatures. And so these are the different platforms that Krishna advises that we can control the body and control the senses. And the more that you're spiritually established in your intelligence, the more you'll be fixed in the proper course of action and sensual control on the material level. And and that lust then is the greatest enemy of the soul, because it destroys your spiritual knowledge and it's constantly tempting you. And this is really the battleground of free will. Right? Lust is constantly provoking us, and on the other side we have transcendental knowledge. It's just like Bugs Bunny or Elmer Fudd. You'll see the angel and the devil on their shoulders. And so on one side you have the angel, which is the scriptures, it's spiritual knowledge, it's knowledge of yourself as a soul. It's the path of yoga. And on the other side you have the path of lust, the path of material desires that are inflamed within the senses and within the mind. And spiritual life is really a choice between these two. Which do I want to follow? And so you have this free will. And Krishna also goes into detail about transcendental knowledge and where it comes from. Ultimately, it comes from him. And he instructs various people within the universe. Specifically, he mentions the sun god. And then from the sun god, it makes its way into human society through various kings. And it descends through various systems of disciplic succession, through guru-disciple relationship. And Krishna also talks about how you access that guru-disciple relationship, the right attitude that you have to have in order to receive the electricity of transcendental knowledge. It's just like if you have the electricity running within your wall and through the outlets. Each of the outlets is connected to a circuit, and each of the circuits is connected, ultimately by way of electrical poles and everything, or underground cables, all the way to the powerhouse, which is connected to the power source. And so in the same way, the power source is Krishna himself. It's God, it's the transcendental platform, and it enters into the world through the Vedas and then comes down through the disciple-guru relationship. And if you're connected to a proper guru, then that knowledge will reach you, and it's powerful. It has a very powerful effect. It'll actually change your life. You could see different individuals will present Bhagavad Gita, and it may or may not have an effect on people's life. People may think it's interesting or somehow mystical or something like that. But if the Bhagavad Gita is received through a proper channel, just like an electrical current, it'll have power to transform you. And so that's the nature of transcendental knowledge, is it has to come down from a proper source, and it has to have that power behind it. And Krishna also talks about the various systems of sacrifice, because what happens is when you perform your duties or you perform any activity with transcendental knowledge as the foundation, it delivers you from material illusion and ignorance, it purifies you of sin, and it helps you to move towards liberation. And your activities become what's called yajna, or sacrifice. So your activities turn into sacrifice. And sacrifice ultimately is meant for Vishnu. It's meant for the Supreme Lord. And the highest elevation of this principle is when all of your activities become devotional offerings to God. And And so there are various ways in which one performs ritualized activities or different forms of responsibilities where they become yajna or sacrifice, and they're offered to the Supreme. And these offerings, they gradually elevate you. As you go through this process of acting with transcendental knowledge, your knowledge grows and grows and grows, and that light grows brighter and brighter and brighter, and you see things more and more clearly. And ultimately, this is very fascinating. There's one particular verse in the Bhagavad Gita where Krishna describes, and it's given the analogy or the imagery of like a fire sacrifice. Like an individual is there performing one of these Vedic sacrifices, and the fire is burning, and he's offering, first he enters into it and he's kind of in material illusion, and he's offering grains, he's offering ghee or clarified butter, he's chanting mantras. There's the different aspects of the sacrifice are all around. But he's meditating upon Brahman. He's meditating upon the absolute truth. He has that transcendental knowledge. And by performing that sacrifice, gradually, he starts to see that, wait a minute, these tools in my hand, they're Brahman. And the grains that I'm offering, they're Brahman. And the clarified butter of the sacrifice, it's Brahman. And the Agni, the fire, it's Brahman. And everyone here, the people performing the sacrifice, they're all Brahman. And so by performing sacrifices with knowledge of Brahman, you gradually realize that everything is Brahman. It's kind of like you entered in an illusion with the curtain over your eyes of material energy. It's called Maya, or that which is not. You've entered in with a kind of illusory understanding of what reality is, and you're in total darkness and ignorance. And yet by performing these sacrifices with the proper transcendental knowledge, you gradually become illuminated, and you see at the end that everything you've been experiencing is nothing but the absolute truth. That the material existence itself and material energy, including yourself, all of these things are nothing but different transformations of the energy of Brahman. Brahman is everything, right? Including yourself. Aham Brahmasmi. I am part of Brahman. And so in this way, it leads to a full spiritual realization of the true spiritual nature of reality, which can't be seen due to material illusion. And why do these sacrifices have the power to show this? Well, because the sacrifices come from Brahman. They come ultimately from Krishna or God, and therefore they have the power to reveal God. It's like within them, just like that electric current. And so if you're able to do those activities while meditating upon the absolute truth, they will reveal the absolute truth. So this is a very powerful mystical process. You can imagine like a warrior, like say you have a samurai or something, and he's on the battlefield actually fighting, and it may seem like a mundane activity. That you have two samurai. One samurai is fighting and he's slashing with his sword, and he's meditating on how he wants to rise through the ranks of the army. He wants to become a captain and a general, and if he has all this ambition, and he's going to enjoy through his activities, right? And so he doesn't get any spiritual fruit from his activities, even though he may be following the code of Bushido. He may be following the various regulations that make him a samurai, and yet he's motivated by selfish desire. And therefore all the activities he performs, they come back to him as karma, and he's bound within the world. But then you have another samurai who's fixed in transcendental knowledge. He's like a yogi, and he's there on the battlefield, and he's meditating, Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. And he's doing it in full consciousness of Brahman. And because his duties ultimately come from Brahman, they come from the absolute truth, theoretically in this example, then they have the power to reveal Brahman. And by doing those duties in Brahman consciousness or with transcendental knowledge, they're no longer material duties. They're karma yoga. It's yoga, but utilizing your karma, utilizing your material nature and your duties and your activities. And so that duty then, he's sitting there fighting on the battlefield, and he's swinging his sword and everything like that. But gradually he becomes spiritually illuminated right there on the battlefield, and he enters into enlightenment. And he has this, and so you have this enlightened warrior fighting on the battlefield, seeing that not only is he Brahman, but all the warriors on the battlefield are Brahman. His sword is Brahman. The battlefield itself is Brahman. Everything is true spiritual nature. And this is really what Krishna is talking about in terms of transcendental knowledge, that you're not the body, right? That the different warriors on the battlefield, they're not their body either. They're pure spirit souls. They are Brahman. And so there's different systems of sacrifice and the different duties regulated by the Vedic scriptures. They have the power to reveal Brahman. And if you had this enlightened samurai swinging his sword, illuminated with transcendental knowledge, detached from matter, and yet engaging in matter in a detached way, with no desire to enjoy the fruits, he's going to be one heck of a samurai. This is like his sword is wheeling like a firebrand, with spiritual power, right? Even on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, there's incidents where Arjuna, he actually fires an arrow into one particular warrior, Bhishma, his grandfather, who's actually a great and powerful yogi himself. And he says that, when this arrow enters into me, I know it's Arjuna who shot me. This isn't like a deadly wound. It's just like it kind of sticks into his arm or something. When I know the wound has stuck into me, I know it's Arjuna's arrow because it feels like the rod of a Brahmin. It feels like the stick that a priest carries, right? And he can feel the spiritual potency when the arrow hits him. And that's because Arjuna is an enlightened consciousness. So this isn't a mundane battle by any means. It's actually yogis performing their duties, in the form of warriors and enlightened consciousness. And so this is something that we should apply into our own lives, according to Krishna. Whatever it is your duties may be. You may work in an office, or you may work, taking care of the roadways or something like that, or driving a truck, or whatever it may be. That those particular duties, you also do them in divine consciousness. It's no different than being that spiritual warrior. So thank you very much for listening. If you found value in this, please like and subscribe. If you're listening on iTunes, please visit srisachinandana.com/iTunes and leave a positive review. Thank you again. We hope you'll join us next time on Light of the Vedas.